Welcome to History to Snooze By, where stories unfold slowly and the past drifts gently through sound and silence. Tonight's journey takes us along one of the most beloved roads in modern memory, the story of four young men from Liverpool who changed music forever. In this gentle retelling, we'll walk with John, Paul, George, and Ringo, not just through their fame, but through their friendship, their songs, and the quiet moments in between. So take a deep breath, settle in, let the day soften, and let the music carry you. If you enjoy calm, thoughtful storytelling and want to hear more quiet journeys into history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us grow, and it brings more peaceful stories your way. And if you'd like to share your favorite Beatles memory or song, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Now close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin this long and winding story, one quiet step at a time. Chapter 1. The Boys from Liverpool. The city of Liverpool sits along the banks of the River Mersey, where the winds carry the salt of the Irish Sea and gulls circle above rooftops blackened with age. It is a place of stories shaped by trade and tides, where ships once brought goods, strangers, and new sounds from far-off places. After the Second World War, the city was tired. Its docks were quieter, its buildings battered by bombs, and its people were rebuilding their lives in the shadows of a conflict that had touched every corner of Britain. In the narrow streets and modest row houses, families did what they could with what they had. There were ration books, coal fires, and second-hand radios humming softly in the evenings. Liverpool, though worn and scarred, had something powerful at its core, a rhythm. It came from the ships and sailors, from Irish folk songs and American jazz, and from the rough, bright humor of people who learned to keep smiling no matter how hard the days were. It was in this city, under these skies, that four boys were born. John Lennon was the first to arrive. He was born on October 9th, 1940, right in the middle of an air raid. His mother, Julia, gave birth to him at Liverpool Maternity Hospital while the sirens wailed and bombs fell in the distance. His father, Alfred Lennon, was a merchant seaman and often away at sea. The war had scattered families like leaves in the wind, and John's parents soon drifted apart. Julia was vibrant and musical, fond of dancing and laughter, but the weight of raising a child alone was too much for her. So John was taken in by his Aunt Mimi and Uncle George, who lived in a quiet suburb called Woolton. Aunt Mimi was proper and strict, often clashing with John's wild streak, but she gave him stability. The house at 251 Minlove Avenue had clean carpets and quiet rules. John, though, had fire in his spirit. He drew comics, scribbled nonsense poems, and got into trouble at school. His mother remained a presence, popping in and out of his life with a wink and a giggle. She was the one who taught him to play the banjo, planting the first seed of music in him. When she was tragically killed by a car in 1958, it left a deep scar that never fully healed. John was 17, angry, searching, and carrying more loss than most could see. Paul McCartney was born 2 years later, on June 18, 1942, in Walton Hospital, just a few miles from John. His family life was different. Paul grew up in a close-knit household filled with music and love. His father, Jim, had once been a jazz musician and kept a piano in the front room. His mother, Mary, was a midwife, kind, hardworking, and deeply respected. She worked long hours and held the family together with gentle strength. Tragedy came to Paul too, though. When he was just 14, Mary died from complications after surgery. It was sudden and devastating. Paul, like John, turned to music for comfort. He had learned to play a bit of trumpet, then guitar, and found that writing songs helped him cope with the sadness he didn't know how to say out loud. He met John soon after at a church garden fete where John's band, the Quarrymen, was playing. Paul showed off his guitar skills and impressed John enough to be invited to join. A bond formed quickly. Two boys from similar streets, both carrying grief, both with a sharp sense of humor and a love of words. George Harrison was younger still, born on February 25, 1943. He grew up on a street called Arnold Grove, in a small terraced house with thin walls and a cold floor. His father, Harold, was a bus conductor, and his mother, Louise, loved to sing around the house. George was quiet, observant, and gentle in spirit. He loved jokes, motorbikes, and Indian music, though the last would come later. At school, George sat on the same bus as Paul, who was a year older. They struck up a friendship, sharing records and guitar tips. Paul introduced George to John, who was skeptical at first. George seemed so young. But once George played a few fast rock and roll licks, John relented. His talent was obvious, and he joined the group while still in his early teens. Together, the three boys rehearsed wherever they could, borrowing equipment, copying American records, and learning how to sing in tight harmony. The last piece of the puzzle would come later, and his name was Richard Starkey, though everyone would know him as Ringo. Born on July 7, 1940, Ringo's early years were marked by illness. He spent long stretches in the hospital, recovering from peritonitis and later tuberculosis. Because of this, his schooling was patchy and his path wandered. But he was cheerful, kind, and good with rhythm. Ringo grew up in the Dingle, a working-class neighborhood not far from the docks. His stepfather bought him his first real drum kit, and he found his way into local bands, including Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. By the early 60s, he was one of the most well-known drummers in Liverpool, famous for his solid timing and steady beat. When the Beatles needed a new drummer, Ringo was the obvious choice. He joined the band in 1962 just as their fortunes were beginning to rise. By that point, the group had played in rough clubs in Hamburg, Germany, where they learned to perform for hours each night. Those days were gritty and raw, filled with noise, exhaustion, and cheap lodgings, but they forged a bond. The Beatles became tighter, louder, and more confident. They learned how to hold a crowd and how to carry one another through tough nights. Back in Liverpool, they played regularly at the Cavern Club, a dark, sweaty cellar where the walls dripped with moisture and the sound of electric guitars echoed under the brick arches. The crowds loved them. There was something fresh in their harmonies, something cheeky in their jokes. They wore leather jackets and played with attitude, but underneath, they had charm and a sense of fun that set them apart. Brian Epstein first saw them at the Cavern. He was a young manager from a local record store, well-dressed and refined, out of place in the Smoky Club. But he saw something in them, something that others had missed. He believed in them, not just as a band, but as a phenomenon. With Brian's help, they polished their image. Out went the leathers, in came the suits. They still had the same wit and energy, but now they looked the part of rising stars. It would take time, of course. Rejection came first. Several labels turned them down. But in 1962, they finally signed with EMI and began recording with producer George Martin. Martin was classical by training, a man of order and elegance. But he was open-minded, and he saw the raw potential in these boys from the North. Together, they shaped a sound that was bright, melodic, and full of invention. Their first single, Love Me Do, climbed modestly up the charts. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it was a start. The next songs would do more. With Please Please Me, they hit #1, and things changed quickly after that. The Beatles were on the map, and their journey from working-class beginnings to global fame had truly begun. But before all the television lights and screaming crowds, there were long walks to school, cold rehearsal rooms, handwritten lyrics scribbled in notebooks, and afternoons spent listening to borrowed records. Each of them brought something different: John's sharp tongue and rebellious spirit, Paul's melodic gifts and charm, George's quiet depth and curiosity, and Ringo's easy warmth and steady hands. They didn't know it then, but they were creating something that would last. Not just songs, but a feeling, a kind of likeness, a spark. The Beatles didn't emerge fully formed. They were shaped by their city, by sorrow, by friendship, and by the simple joy of making music together. In Liverpool, the streets still echo with their presence. The homes where they lived, the schools they attended, the clubs they played, they remain part of the story. A story that began not with a hit record, but with four boys growing up in a city full of rain and rhythm, dreaming of something more. And so their journey begins, not yet famous, not yet legends, but already bonded by sound and song, walking the long and winding road that would lead them far beyond the banks of the Mersey. Chapter 2: Finding the Beat. In the years after the war, music drifted into British homes like sunlight through drawn curtains. Radios hummed softly in kitchens. Older generations preferred ballads or light orchestra pieces, but young ears were tuning into something else, something lively, full of rhythm, something that made them want to move. American rock and roll had found its way across the Atlantic, and in cities like Liverpool, it struck a chord. For boys like John, Paul, and George, this new sound was more than entertainment. It was a spark. The voices of Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard crackled through radio speakers and scratched vinyl records. Their energy, their swagger, their melodies, they all pointed to another world. A world beyond school uniforms and factory jobs. A world where someone with a guitar and a voice could change everything. John Lennon felt it first. He had already begun scribbling lyrics in his notebooks, inventing jokes and stories, using humor to shield the rougher corners of his life. When he discovered skiffle music, a British take on American folk and blues, something clicked. It was raw and simple, often played with homemade instruments like washboards and tea-chest basses. Anyone could join in. Anyone could start a band. So he did. John formed a group with friends from school and called it the Quarrymen, after Quarry Bank High School, where he was enrolled. They played at local parties and church events, strumming enthusiastically if not always in perfect time. John stood at the center, his guitar slung high and his voice full of youthful bravado. He wasn't polished, but he had presence. People noticed him. It was at one of these local gigs, held in the garden of St. Peter's Church in Woolton, that a friend introduced John to a boy named Paul McCartney. Paul showed up wearing a jacket, his hair combed neatly, with his guitar in hand. After the performance, the two talked. Paul asked if he could tune John's guitar. Then he played a few songs, 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran among them, and did so with ease. He could switch chords cleanly, and he knew how to sing and play at the same time. John was impressed. There was a pause. John had to decide whether to invite Paul into the group. He was younger, and John was used to being in charge. But the talent was clear, and John wasn't foolish. He recognized something in Paul, not just skill, but balance. Where John was fiery and rebellious, Paul was steady and smooth. They could complement each other. So Paul joined the Quarrymen. And from that moment, the core of what would become the Beatles began to form. They met to practice in living rooms, bedrooms, and backyards. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they laughed until their stomachs hurt. But they always played. Paul began writing songs, and John did the same. They'd sit across from each other with guitars in their laps, tossing ideas back and forth. Even then, they instinctively knew when something worked. They were teaching each other, learning how to build a song, not just with chords and lyrics, but with feeling. George Harrison entered the picture not long after. Paul had been riding the bus to school with George for a while. They'd bonded over guitars and music. Paul spoke highly of him, and John agreed to listen, reluctantly at first. George was younger, smaller, more reserved. But when he picked up his guitar and played a lead solo with fast fingers and clear notes, John couldn't deny it. George was in. The three of them practiced constantly. They played covers of American rock and roll, folk tunes, and whatever was popular at the time. They performed at youth clubs, community centers, and school halls. At one gig, they called themselves Johnny and the Moondogs. Another time, they used the Rainbows. The name kept changing, but their sound was taking shape. They listened closely to every record they could find. Chuck Berry's riffs, the harmonies of the Everly Brothers, the swagger of Gene Vincent. Paul especially loved Little Richard's energy and Elvis's croon. John leaned toward Buddy Holly, who not only sang, but also wrote his own songs and led his own band. Holly's group, the Crickets, even inspired their future name, the Beatles, though that decision would come later. At that stage, they didn't have proper equipment. Guitars were borrowed or bought secondhand. Amplifiers were unreliable. They carried their gear on buses, rain soaking their clothes, fingers numb with cold, but they kept going. Because when they played together, it felt like something bigger than themselves. Their musical instincts were growing. John's rough edge balanced Paul's precision. George, though quiet, had a sharp ear for melody and a natural sense of arrangement. The three of them were young and untrained, but they were listening to each other, to the world, and to something inside them that said, "Keep going." In 1959, they crossed paths with another local musician named Stuart Sutcliffe. Stuart was John's friend from art school, moody, thoughtful, talented with the paintbrush. He didn't know much about music, but he had presence and charisma. John convinced him to buy a bass guitar and join the band. Stuart agreed, more for the friendship than the fame. He stood at the back of the stage, his bass often unplugged, but his look, sunglasses, dark clothes, silent cool, added something important to their image. The band had become a group of four, with rotating drummers filling in when needed. Their names changed again, from the Quarrymen to the Silver Beatles, then finally, simply, the Beatles. The spelling was playful, a nod to the beat of music, and also a little mysterious. It suited them. Then came Hamburg. A club owner in Germany was looking for English bands to play long sets for rowdy crowds. The pay wasn't great, and the conditions weren't glamorous, but it was a chance. So the Beatles, still teenagers, packed up and took a ferry to the continent. What they found there would shape them more than they could have imagined. They played in clubs like the Indra and the Kaiser Keller, surrounded by red lights and cigarette smoke. The crowds were loud, the nights long. Sometimes they played for 8 hours with barely a break. They slept in cramped rooms behind movie screens or above clubs. Food was basic. Money was tight. But they played and played and played. Night after night, they sharpened their sound. They learned how to fill time, how to keep a crowd's attention, how to stretch songs and still stay interesting. They watched each other closely, adjusting rhythm, volume, tempo, and tone. George's solos became cleaner. Paul's bass lines became bolder. John's vocals became stronger. They were turning into professionals, even if the word felt too big at the time. In Hamburg, the group also met Pete Best, a young drummer with a steady hand and dark looks. He joined them for the German gigs and became part of the core lineup. Now, with Pete on drums and Stuart on bass, the group had 5 members. They played together until their fingers ached and their voices gave out. But not everything was smooth. Stuart, though beloved by John, was growing more distant. His passion was still painting, and his girlfriend Astrid Kircher, a German photographer, encouraged him to follow that path. He eventually left the band, staying behind in Hamburg to study art. His departure was gentle but emotional. John, especially, felt the loss. When the group returned to Liverpool, something had changed. They were tighter, louder, and more confident. Their hair was longer, influenced by the German style. They wore black clothes and moved with a swagger they hadn't had before. They returned not as a group of boys playing for fun, but as a band with purpose. Back home, they resumed playing at the Cavern Club, now drawing bigger crowds. Their music had polish. Their harmonies were tighter. Their stage presence had matured. They had become something new, not yet famous, but no longer just a local act. The Beatles were beginning to find their beat, not only musically, but as people. John was still the sharpest-tongued, prone to sarcasm and flashes of brilliance. Paul was emerging as a melodic craftsman, always thinking ahead, always seeking the perfect sound. George, still the youngest, had become quietly confident, letting his guitar speak for him. And Pete, steady on drums, held the group together through the chaos of gigs and rehearsals. They were still struggling, still unknown outside their city, but they were moving. The long hours, the setbacks, the moments of doubt, all of it was shaping them. They weren't just copying American songs anymore. They were writing their own. Simple at first. Lyrics about love, youth, and hope. But the seeds were there. Their beat was no longer borrowed. It was becoming their own. Chapter 3. Hard Days in Hamburg. Hamburg was not a quiet city. It was loud, gritty, and full of energy. Ships from around the world filled its harbor, and people came and went at all hours of the day and night. There were bars and theaters, neon signs and narrow streets, smoke-filled cafes and late-night diners where tired musicians and sailors drank strong coffee to stay awake. In this place of motion and noise, the Beatles came to play. They were still young, barely out of school when they first arrived. John, Paul, George, and Stuart were packed into a small van with their instruments and a few belongings. Pete Best was now their drummer, and together, the five of them made the trip across the water. They didn't know what to expect. The promise had been simple: steady gigs and a place to stay. But the reality was harder. The first club they played was called the Indra, located on Gross Freiheit Street in the Reeperbahn district, a place known for its nightclubs, dance halls, and adult theaters. It wasn't glamorous. The club was dim, crowded, and noisy. They were expected to play for hours every night, sometimes with only a short break in between. The sets were long and tiring. They had to keep people entertained, no matter how late it got or how tired they felt. They stayed in a back room behind a cinema. The walls were bare, the beds were hard, and there was barely enough space to stretch out. It was cold and damp. There was no privacy, and the shared bathroom was down the hall. Meals were simple and often rushed: sausage rolls, sandwiches, whatever they could find and afford. But they didn't complain. They had come to play, and they threw themselves into it. In Hamburg, they learned how to perform, not just play. The crowds were rough and direct. If the music was slow, they shouted. If it was too loud, they laughed. The Beatles had to win them over each night. They did this by watching, adjusting, and giving everything they had on stage. They danced, joked, sang, and played as if every show was their last. John would crack jokes between songs. Paul kept the tempo steady and smiled at the crowd. George worked on cleaner solos and practiced until his fingers ached. Pete kept a steady beat night after night. And Stuart, though quiet, had a certain charm that added to their look. They began to tighten as a group. Playing together night after night forced them to listen more closely to each other. If one made a mistake, the others followed and covered. They developed signals, a glance, a nod, a quick chord, that kept the music going no matter what. They learned timing, rhythm, control, and they began to find their voice. The long hours took a toll, of course. There were nights when their energy wore thin. Arguments flared. Tempers rose. But beneath it all was a shared purpose. They were becoming something more than five boys in a band. They were becoming a unit, solid, sharp, and full of promise. Eventually, they moved from the Indra to the Kaiserkeller, a bigger club owned by the same promoter. The crowds were larger and more demanding. Another Liverpool band, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, was also playing there. That group's drummer was Richard Starkey, known to everyone as Ringo. Ringo had a kind smile and an easy laugh. He watched the Beatles closely, and played with precision and style. The two bands crossed paths often. Though Ringo wasn't a Beatle yet, the seed had been planted. In the Kaiserkeller, the noise never stopped. The music started in the early evening and often went past midnight. The room was thick with cigarette smoke. The air was heavy. People danced, drank, shouted, and sometimes fought. The Beatles played louder, faster, and better than ever before. They started experimenting, mixing songs, changing arrangements, playing songs faster or slower depending on the crowd. They were learning how to read a room and how to control it with sound. One of their most important lessons came not from playing, but from listening. In Hamburg, they met other musicians, Germans, Brits, and visiting Americans, who shared records, techniques, and ideas. They sat together in stairwells and corners between sets, talking about tone, timing, and harmony. They passed guitars back and forth, showing each other new chords and riffs. The Beatles absorbed it all. Outside the clubs, life was harder. Money was scarce. Their living quarters were noisy and small. At times, the cold bit through their thin jackets. Food was simple, and sleep came late. But in the midst of that discomfort, they were growing. The hardship gave them edge. The hunger gave them drive. The tight quarters taught them how to live and work closely, even when it was difficult. Then, one night, things changed suddenly. George was found to be too young to work under the local rules. German authorities sent him back to Liverpool. The others soon followed. Their permit had expired and the trip had come to a sudden stop. They returned home with few belongings, but more experience than any music school could offer. But Hamburg wasn't over yet. It called them back again and again. Each time they returned, they were stronger. They played new clubs, the Top 10 Club and later the Star Club. These venues were bigger, with better equipment and more serious audiences. The long hours continued, but so did their growth. It was during these later trips that Stuart Sutcliffe left the group for good. He had fallen in love with Astrid Kircher, whose photography had become part of their image. Stuart wanted to return to painting. He stepped aside gently, knowing his heart wasn't in music the way it was in art. He passed his bass guitar to Paul, who switched from rhythm guitar to bass out of necessity. Paul didn't want to at first, but he adjusted and soon made it his own. The lineup was now solid: John, Paul, George, and Pete. They were leaner, louder, more focused. They had learned discipline without losing their edge. And with each night they played, they moved closer to something new. In Hamburg, they had become a band, not just by name, but in spirit. They had learned how to keep time with one another, how to blend voices, how to face a tough crowd and still play well. They had learned how to endure. When they finally returned to Liverpool for good, the change was clear. People who had seen them before were surprised by how far they had come. Their set lists were tighter, their harmonies were cleaner, their confidence had grown. The Cavern Club welcomed them back, and their shows drew larger crowds. There was talk around town, whispers that the Beatles were different now. Not just another local act, something more, something close to ready. Hamburg had left its mark. It had sharpened their edges, tested their patience, and stretched their limits. It had pulled them out of their comfort zone and forced them to grow. They had played until their fingers were raw, slept in corners, shared cheap meals, and faced crowds who didn't always listen. But they had kept going. And now, back in Liverpool, they stood taller, not with fame yet, but with something just as important. They had found their place. They had found their strength. They had found each other. Chapter 4: Becoming the Beatles. Back in Liverpool, the city hadn't changed much, but the band had. The Beatles returned from Hamburg sharper, faster, and louder. The long nights in Germany had made them stronger musicians, but they still weren't famous. They were known in local circles. People in Liverpool talked about them, how tight they were, how they made jokes between songs, how their harmonies filled the Cavern Club like no other band. But outside of that world, few knew their names. They had talent, no question. They had energy too. But what they didn't have yet was direction. They needed someone who could see the full picture. Someone who understood what they were becoming, even before they did. That person was Brian Epstein. Brian worked at his family's store, NIMS, North End Music Stores, which sold records, sheet music, and musical instruments. He was well-dressed, polite, and carried himself with calm confidence. He wasn't a musician himself, but he had a deep love for classical music and show tunes. He also had a sharp ear and a sense for talent. One day, a young customer came into the store asking for a record by the Beatles. Brian hadn't heard of them. Curious, he asked around and learned they were playing regularly at the Cavern Club, so he went to see them. He wasn't quite sure what to expect. The cavern was cramped and dark. The walls were dripping with condensation. People were packed shoulder to shoulder. Then the band took the stage. John, Paul, George, and Pete played as they always did, with heart, rhythm, and humor. They weren't polished, but they had charm. Their timing was good. Their voices blended well, and they seemed to draw energy from the crowd itself. Brian watched, quietly but closely. He saw something not just in their sound, but in their presence. They had it, whatever it was. After a few more visits, Brian decided he wanted to manage them. He didn't have much experience in that field, but he had drive. He believed they could be more than just a local band. He believed they could be bigger than anyone imagined. At first, the idea of having a manager didn't sit well with everyone. John in particular was skeptical. He didn't like the idea of rules or formality. But Brian wasn't pushy. He was patient. He listened. He understood their personalities and gave them space to remain themselves. Slowly, they began to trust him. Brian brought order. He helped them clean up their act, not by changing who they were, but by shaping how they presented themselves. He suggested they wear suits on stage. He asked them to bow after songs. He encouraged them to stop eating and smoking during shows. At first, these ideas felt strange to the group. But they noticed that crowds responded differently. Something clicked. With Brian's guidance, they began to look more like a unit. A real band with direction. He set up photo shoots. He arranged meetings. And most importantly, he started chasing a record deal. It wasn't easy. Several labels turned them down. Executives didn't see what Brian saw. They thought the group was too rough, too northern, too odd. But Brian didn't give up. He traveled to London, knocked on doors, made phone calls, and kept trying. And finally, in 1962, he reached George Martin at Parlophone, a division of EMI. George Martin was thoughtful and experienced. He had worked on classical recordings, comedy albums, and pop singles. When he met the Beatles, he wasn't immediately convinced by their music, but he liked their humor. They were clever, quick-witted, and willing to learn. George saw potential, especially in their personalities. He agreed to a test session at Abbey Road Studios. The band was nervous. The studio was more formal than anything they'd known, but they did their best. They played a few songs. They made jokes. George Martin listened. After the session, Martin told Brian that he liked them, but he had one concern: the drummer. Pete Best had been with the group through the Hamburg years. He was reliable and quiet. But in the studio, George Martin wasn't convinced he had the flexibility or feel needed for recording. This put the band in a difficult position. They liked Pete. They had history with him. But if they wanted to move forward, they had to make a choice. After long talks and hard thinking, they decided to replace Pete. It wasn't easy. The decision caused tension among fans, and the band felt the weight of it. But they knew they had to grow. They turned to someone they already knew: Ringo Starr. Ringo had been playing with Rory Storm in the Hurricanes. He was cheerful, easygoing, and a solid drummer. More than that, he had chemistry with the group. He'd filled in for Pete once or twice before. When they asked him to join, he said yes. And just like that, the final lineup was complete. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. With Ringo on drums and George Martin producing, they returned to Abbey Road to record what would become their first single, Love Me Do. The song was simple, built around a harmonica riff, steady rhythm, and a gentle melody. It wasn't a massive hit, but it reached the charts, enough to get attention. Their next single, Please Please Me, changed everything. It was upbeat, catchy, and full of energy. It hit #1. Suddenly, the Beatles were not just a band from Liverpool. They were something new. They quickly recorded their first full album, also titled Please Please Me. It was done in just one day, a burst of music recorded live, track after track, in a single session. By the time the last song, Twist and Shout, was recorded, John's voice was almost gone. But he gave it everything he had. The result was raw, powerful, and unforgettable. With that album, the wave began to build. The band toured constantly. They appeared on television shows. They gave interviews. Crowds grew larger with every show. Young fans screamed, cried, and chased after them. Their songs played on every radio. Their faces were printed in newspapers and on posters. But underneath the fame, they remained close. They still joked with each other, still worked out harmonies in hotel rooms, still worried about missing chords or forgetting lyrics. The fame was growing fast, but their friendship held firm. They didn't always agree, of course. There were 4 strong personalities. John was sharp and rebellious. Paul was polished and thoughtful. George was observant and growing more confident. Ringo was relaxed and steady. But somehow it worked. They balanced each other out. Brian Epstein continued to guide their career with care. He protected them from the press when he could. He scheduled tours and meetings. He tried to keep their lives organized in a world that was quickly becoming chaotic. George Martin brought structure and vision to their recordings. He encouraged them to try new things. He listened to their ideas and helped shape them. He wasn't just a producer, he was a partner, a quiet fifth member who helped translate their creativity into sound. By the end of 1963, the Beatles were no longer a local act. They were a national sensation. Their music had spread across Britain. Their shows were packed, and they were preparing to step beyond the borders of their home country. They were becoming more than a band. They were becoming a movement. But before the world truly opened its doors, they had to hold steady. The road ahead would be long, and it would not always be easy. But for now, the 4 of them stood side by side, ready to take the next step. They had started with borrowed guitars and crowded clubs. They had played through cold nights and long sets. They had changed drummers, written songs, and traveled across Europe. Now they stood at the edge of something bigger, still together, still learning, still becoming the Beatles. Chapter 5: The Birth of Beatlemania. The air felt different in 1963. There was a charge, like something was shifting in the rhythm of everyday life. Teenagers dressed a little bolder. Radios played a little louder. People started humming along in the streets and dancing in their bedrooms. It wasn't just the music. It was the feeling that something new had arrived. And that something, or rather those someones, were 4 young men from Liverpool. The Beatles had released their debut album, Please Please Me, in March. It had been recorded in a single day, but its sound carried far beyond the walls of Abbey Road studios. The songs were fresh, catchy, and full of energy. They sounded like fun. They sounded like freedom. Listeners heard the joy in Paul's voice, the grit in John's, the sparkle in George's guitar, and the solid heartbeat of Ringo's drumming. It wasn't just music, it was a new kind of voice. From that moment, the Beatles began to move faster. Their next singles, From Me to You and She Loves You, each soared to #1. She Loves You, with its cheerful yeah, yeah refrain, became a kind of anthem. It was sung in schoolyards, on buses, in shops, and homes. The phrase took on a life of its own. Even those who weren't sure about pop music couldn't escape it. The press began to notice. At first, some newspapers called them a fad, a flash in the pan. But then the crowds kept growing. Girls gathered outside theaters, screaming at the top of their lungs. Police struggled to control the excitement. Reporters started following the band from one town to the next, documenting every move. John's sharp wit in interviews, Paul's easy charm, George's quiet observations, and Ringo's kind smile made them even more beloved. A term was needed for what was happening. And so, one was invented, Beatlemania. It wasn't just a clever word. It described something real. People didn't just like the Beatles, they adored them. They chased after their car. They lined up for hours before shows. Some fainted just seeing them walk on stage. It was joy, devotion, and noise all wrapped together. But through it all, the Beatles stayed focused. They still rehearsed carefully. They still worked on harmonies and arrangements. Fame didn't slow them down. If anything, it pushed them to do more. That same year, they released their second album, with the Beatles. It showed growth. The songs had more variety. Their writing was evolving, but the energy was still there. The harmonies were tighter. The guitars more confident. They covered American artists they admired like Chuck Berry and Smokey Robinson, but their original songs began to stand taller beside them. They started touring across Britain in bigger venues. The theaters were packed, and the crowds often drowned out the music. It didn't matter. People came just to see them, to be in the same room, to feel that shared thrill of being part of something special. What made the Beatles so beloved was not just their songs, but their connection to their audience. They seemed real. They weren't distant stars in expensive suits. They were funny, clever, and down to earth. In interviews, they made jokes. On stage, they smiled and waved. They didn't take themselves too seriously, and people felt close to them because of that. Radio stations played their songs constantly. Music stores couldn't keep records in stock. Magazines printed photo spreads and posters. Beatles haircuts became a trend. Young people copied their clothes, collarless jackets, Cuban-heeled boots, simple black and white styles that felt modern and clean. But while the excitement spread across Britain, something even bigger was starting to stir across the ocean. In America, British music had never really broken through. American charts were filled with homegrown acts, and most listeners didn't pay much attention to bands from overseas. But the Beatles were different. Their manager, Brian Epstein, and producer George Martin began working to open the door. Capitol Records, their American label, had been hesitant at first. But as news of Beatlemania crossed the Atlantic, they changed their tune. They released I Want to Hold Your Hand in the United States in December of 1963. Within weeks, it shot to #1. American television producers took notice. One of them was Ed Sullivan. The Ed Sullivan Show was one of the most watched programs in the country. Families gathered around their televisions every Sunday evening. When Ed heard about the frenzy in England, he invited the Beatles to perform. It would be their first live appearance on American TV. On February 7, 1964, the Beatles flew to New York. Thousands of fans met them at the airport, screaming and waving signs. Reporters crowded around, firing questions. The band was stunned by the welcome. They had hoped to make an impression, but this was something more. 2 nights later, they stepped onto the Ed Sullivan stage. Over 70 million people watched at home, a record audience. They wore suits and ties, smiled at the camera, and sang All My Loving Till There Was You, and She Loves You. The crowd roared. Teenagers across the country screamed. And in living rooms from coast to coast, a generation felt something shift. The Beatles had arrived in America, and the world would never be the same. They stayed in the United States for a few weeks, playing concerts in Washington, D.C., Miami, and New York. The shows were packed. Fans camped outside hotels. Police escorted them from place to place. It was intense, but the Beatles handled it with grace. They joked in interviews, waved from windows, and played with full hearts. When they returned to Britain, they weren't just a local phenomenon anymore. They were international stars. But the band didn't rest. They kept writing, kept recording. They knew fame could fade, so they worked even harder. In the summer of 1964, they filmed their first movie, A Hard Day's Night. It wasn't just a musical performance film. It had humor, charm, and captured the spirit of Beatlemania with a light touch. It showed their personalities, their friendships, and their life on the road. The film was a hit, and so was the soundtrack album. The title track, A Hard Day's Night, had come from something Ringo had said after a long session. It was a funny, mixed-up phrase, the kind that captured the mood perfectly. The song itself was sharp and exciting. From the very first chord, it caught your attention and didn't let go. They toured more, traveling across Europe and Australia. In every country, the reaction was the same. Crowds waited at train stations. Fans lined the streets. Concerts were packed. The world couldn't get enough. But behind the scenes, it was exhausting. The schedule was relentless. They barely had time to sleep. Every day brought a new city, a new show, a new group of fans outside the window. Still, they pushed forward. They released more music. Can't Buy Me Love, 8 Days a Week, I Feel Fine. Each song reached the top of the charts. Each added to their growing legacy. They were writing constantly, often in hotel rooms or on planes. Sometimes John and Paul would sit together with guitars in their laps, working out melodies and lyrics. Other times, they wrote alone and brought ideas to each other later. Their partnership was strong, not without disagreement, but full of respect and creativity. George also began to grow as a songwriter. He studied their techniques, wrote on his own, and waited patiently for his songs to be included. Ringo, too, contributed with his distinct drumming style and steady presence. He often brought a calming energy to the group. As 1964 turned into 1965, the Beatles stood at the top of the music world. They had achieved more than most artists dreamed of. But they weren't finished. They still had ideas to explore, sounds to shape, stories to tell. Beatlemania had lifted them high. The screams, the posters, the headlines, all of it had been a whirlwind. But beneath it all, they remained what they had always been, four musicians who loved playing together, for friends who shared a bond that fame could not erase. And as the noise around them grew louder, they began to look inward, toward the studio, toward experimentation, toward the next chapter. But for now, in the heart of the 1960s, they were the sound of a new generation, a sound that made people dance, dream, and believe in something brighter. The Beatles weren't just a band anymore. They were a moment in time. Chapter 6: Across the Universe. By 1965, the Beatles had become more than musicians. They were part of the daily rhythm of life for millions. Their faces filled magazines. Their songs played in every shop and school dance. Their names were known in cities and villages in languages they had never spoken. But even as the outside world focused on their fame, something inside the band was beginning to shift. The touring continued. From London to Tokyo, from Sydney to Paris, they traveled across time zones and borders, welcomed by crowds so large that streets had to be closed. Police formed barriers. Journalists shouted questions. Children waved hand-drawn signs. And in every city, the scene repeated itself. Limousines pulling up to hotels, a blur of flashes from cameras, and the sound of thousands of voices calling their names. But inside the cars, behind the hotel curtains, the Beatles began to feel the weight of it all. The thrill of performance remained, but the noise never stopped. They couldn't walk through a city without a chase. They couldn't hear themselves on stage anymore. The screaming was so loud that monitors became useless. Sometimes they played entire concerts barely able to hear their own instruments. The chaos around them pushed them inward. And in that space, they started to ask new questions. What kind of music do they want to make now? What could they create if they stepped away from the cycle of constant touring and began exploring the studio more deeply? In the spring of that year, they released Help, both a film and an album. The movie was playful, full of bright colors and light chases, a kind of surreal comedy built around their music. But beneath the humor, the songs told a more honest story. The title track, Help, wasn't just a catchy melody. It was a real cry, written by John during a time when the pressure was building. He later admitted that the cheerful tune masked a deeper feeling, a sense of being lost in the noise, unsure of who he was beneath the Beatle image. Another song from the same album, Yesterday, showed a different side of the group. Paul had written it alone, waking from a dream, with a melody already in his head. He played it on acoustic guitar, backed only by a string quartet. There were no drums, no harmonies, no electric guitars. Just a simple, aching tune about memory and regret. It marked a turning point, showing that their music could be gentle, reflective, and deeply personal. As 1965 continued, they grew even bolder. That year, Queen Elizabeth II honored the Beatles with MBE medals, member of the Order of the British Empire, for their contributions to British culture. Some traditionalists were shocked. Giving such honors to pop musicians felt strange to them, but to many others, it was a sign that something had changed. The Beatles weren't just entertainers. They were shaping the world around them. Later that year, they released Rubber Soul, an album that quietly rewrote what people expected from pop music. Gone were the simple love songs and fast-paced singles. Instead, Rubber Soul offered subtle lyrics, warm acoustic tones, and layered emotions. The songs spoke of uncertainty, longing, and searching. Norwegian Wood told of a strange relationship and ended with a hint of quiet rebellion. In My Life looked back on childhood with soft wonder. Michelle blended languages, while Girl balanced sweetness with sorrow. This wasn't just a shift in sound. It was a sign that the Beatles were growing, not just as musicians, but as people. They read more. They listened to different kinds of music, classical, Indian, folk. They spent quiet nights talking, writing, thinking. They tried new instruments. George began to study the sitar, drawn to its complexity and tone. John became more introspective, exploring his own thoughts and feelings. Paul grew more interested in storytelling through song. Ringo, always steady, remained their center, calm, grounded, supportive. They still gave interviews, still appeared on television, but their answers became more thoughtful. They weren't just playing the part of pop stars anymore. They were asking questions about the world, about themselves, about what came next. Their fans grew with them. People who had first danced to She Loves You now sat quietly with Rubber Soul, listening closely. Critics who had once dismissed them as a passing fad now began to take their work seriously. The Beatles were no longer following the music scene, they were leading it. Touring, however, continued. And while the shows remained full, the joy of it began to fade. In the summer of 1966, they performed in the United States again. But this time, things were different. At one point, before the tour began, John had made a comment during an interview in England, saying that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus now. The remark was meant as a reflection on culture, not faith. But when the quote was printed out of context in America, it caused outrage in certain parts of the country. Some radio stations banned their songs. Some groups staged protests. There were scenes of people burning Beatles records in merchandise in public. It was loud, angry, and confusing. The band responded calmly, but the mood around the tour was tense. Security was tighter. The atmosphere was heavier. They played their shows, but the excitement of earlier years was gone. When they returned to England, they made a decision. No more touring. It was a quiet moment, but a powerful one. After years of travel, noise, and headlines, the Beatles stepped off the road and into the studio. It was a turning point. Without the pressure of live performance, they were free to create without limits. No longer bound by the need to reproduce songs on stage, they could experiment with sound, with ideas, with the very structure of music itself. That same year, they released Revolver. If Rubber Soul had opened the door, Revolver walked boldly through it. The songs were complex and thoughtful. Eleanor Rigby told a story of loneliness backed by strings and sorrow. Tomorrow Never Knows used tape loops, strange effects, and lyrics inspired by Eastern philosophy. Here, there, and everywhere floated gently, full of soft beauty. George contributed Taxman, a sharp commentary on wealth and politics. Ringo sang Yellow Submarine, a playful tune that quickly became a favorite among children and adults alike. The album didn't just reflect where the Beatles were, it reflected where music itself was going. They had taken a step beyond fame, beyond touring, beyond even what people expected of them. They were now exploring sound like painters on a wide canvas. And the studio, Abbey Road, became their workshop. They recorded at odd hours. They layered instruments. They reversed tapes, played them back, then spliced them into new shapes. They brought in string sections, brass, sitars, tamboras, and even recordings of animal sounds. George Martin, ever their quiet partner, helped guide the process, never stopping their curiosity, only helping it take form. This was a new phase, one where creativity came first, one where the noise of crowds gave way to the hum of ideas. Their world had changed, and so had they. No longer just the smiling faces on a poster, the Beatles were becoming something deeper, more complex, more honest. They were reaching beyond the charts, beyond the studios, beyond even the moment they were living in. They were reaching across the universe. Chapter 7: A Studio Revolution. With touring behind them and the studio doors closed to the outside world, the Beatles entered a new phase of their journey. There were no screaming crowds now, no flights between cities, no late-night hotel windows with faces pressed against the glass. In this quiet, creative space, the band found something they had never truly had before: time. Time to experiment, time to listen, time to shape sound instead of simply performing it. Abbey Road Studios became their second home. The familiar halls, the polished floors, and the steady hum of tape machines all became part of their daily rhythm. The rooms were filled with cables and microphones, pianos and drum kits, string instruments, and unfamiliar tools that would help build a new kind of music. The process was no longer about capturing what they could do on stage. It was about exploring what they could imagine. In 1967, that exploration led to an album that would change not just their music, but the direction of popular music itself. The idea came in pieces. Paul had been thinking about how they might step into a role, not just as themselves, but as a fictional band. A band with its own identity, its own sound, a freedom from their public image. And so the concept was born: Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It began with costumes, not ones they would wear on tour, but ones they would wear on the album cover. Bright, colorful military-style jackets, badges, and medals. A band from somewhere else, with a name that rolled off the tongue like something from a traveling circus. This album would not follow the usual rules. There would be no singles released ahead of time. The songs would not stand alone. They would blend together, like chapters in a book or scenes in a play. It was not just a collection of songs, but an experience. They recorded slowly, carefully. They tried new techniques. They layered sounds, built textures. They turned knobs, reversed tapes, and played with timing and pitch. The studio became not just a place to record, but a tool for creation. Paul led the way on many of the tracks. His song, When I'm 64, was whimsical and full of charm, a nod to old-time music hall tunes. Fixing a Hole explored inner restlessness with a calm, drifting rhythm. Lovely Rita painted a playful picture of a meter maid, complete with sound effects and humor. John brought dreamlike songs like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, filled with strange images and gentle surrealism. His voice moved between tones, steady in some places, stretched in others, always looking for feeling rather than perfection. Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite was inspired by a Victorian circus poster and built with swirling organs and crashing rhythms. George contributed Within You, Without You, a track shaped entirely around Indian instruments and themes. It was slow, thoughtful, and deeply spiritual, a reflection of his personal journey into Eastern philosophy and music. And Ringo, always the heartbeat of the group, sang With a Little Help from My Friends. The song was placed right after the opening track, like a soft introduction to the band's new sound. Ringo's warm voice made it feel friendly and close, like a hand on your shoulder. Each track added something different. Together, they formed a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. The final piece was the cover. Designed by artist Peter Blake, the Sgt. Pepper cover was unlike anything seen before. A crowd of faces, both real and imagined, surrounded the Beatles in their new costumes. The image was busy, colorful, strange, and full of hidden details. There were poets and film stars, musicians and philosophers. It looked like a gathering of minds, a celebration of influences. When the album was released in June 1967, it stopped people in their tracks. It wasn't just the music. It was the packaging, the sound, the colors, the attitude. It felt like a moment, something fresh, something bold. Listeners sat with the record in their laps, reading the lyrics as they played each track. They weren't dancing now. They were listening, thinking, feeling. Critics called it a masterpiece. Fans were stunned. Other artists began to see what was possible in the album format. This wasn't just pop music anymore. It was art. The Beatles had raised the bar. But even as the world admired their work, the four of them remained in motion. After Sgt. Pepper, they continued to explore. They recorded the single All You Need Is Love and performed it live via satellite to an audience of hundreds of millions. It was the first global television broadcast of its kind. The message was simple, sung clearly, and without irony. The world was watching, and the Beatles answered with love. Later that year, they took another creative turn. Their manager, Brian Epstein, had passed away suddenly. It was a quiet blow. Brian had been with them from the start. He had guided their career, protected them from chaos, and believed in them when others did not. His absence left a hole. To cope, they threw themselves into a new project, a film and album called Magical Mystery Tour. The film was strange and fragmented, a psychedelic road trip that confused many viewers. But the music held strong. Songs like Fool on the Hill and I Am the Walrus showed their continuing desire to push boundaries. Some parts were playful, others were mysterious. But through it all, there was creativity, color, and heart. The Beatles were no longer trying to fit into any mold. They were breaking them. They began to spend more time on individual projects as well. John became more involved with artist Yoko Ono, and together they began to explore performance art and experimental recordings. Paul worked on orchestral arrangements. George deepened his study of Indian music. Ringo explored film. But even with these separate paths, they kept returning to the studio. The music held them together. In 1968, they traveled to India to study meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. They stayed in a peaceful ashram, surrounded by trees and rivers, far from the noise of the world. There, they wrote dozens of songs. Some were light, some were serious. All were shaped by the stillness around them. When they returned to London, they began work on a new album, one that would reflect all the sides of who they were becoming. It wouldn't be a concept album this time. Instead, it would be a double album filled with variety, a wide mix of styles, moods, and voices. It would be titled simply The Beatles, but most people would come to know it as the White Album because of its plain white cover. Inside were songs of all kinds: folk ballads, rock anthems, lullabies, and noise experiments. Blackbird, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Dear Prudence, Helter Skelter, and Revolution all lived side by side. Each song showed a different shade of the band, both united and separate. The sessions were long and sometimes tense. Each member brought ideas, often recording separately or with different combinations of players. The closeness of earlier years began to stretch, but even then, they made music that stirred hearts and minds. And so, even as the world changed around them, the Beatles continued to evolve. From young boys in suits to studio explorers in their own right, they had reshaped what it meant to be a band. They had shown that pop could be deep, that music could grow, that voices could blend into something timeless. They didn't need the stage anymore. They had found their revolution within. Chapter 8: Gentle Days and Inner Turns. The white cover of their 1968 album spoke louder than any image. It had no photos, no title artwork, no splash of color, just a plain, blank surface. Where once there had been bright costumes and busy collages, now there was space, stillness. It felt like a pause between sentences, a moment of quiet before something shifted. Inside that cover, however, was anything but empty. The White Album was filled with songs of all kinds, some soft and sweet, some loud and rough, some almost whispers, and others wild with energy. It reflected a band pulling in different directions, yet still bound by shared history. The studio sessions were long. Sometimes they worked separately. One would come in early, another late. They no longer needed to be together for every track. In earlier years, they had played shoulder to shoulder. Now, they came with their own songs, their own ideas, their own pace. Paul might work out a piano part alone. John might bring in a piece already formed in his head. George, gaining confidence as a writer, brought new songs that stood tall beside the others. Ringo, feeling uncertain during parts of the process, even left the studio briefly. The space between them was growing. And yet, when the songs came together, something still worked. Not perfectly, not without tension, but with truth. There was honesty in the music, even when it was rough, even when the edges didn't quite meet. Paul gave the world Blackbird, a gentle tune with just his voice and guitar, telling a story of quiet hope. He also recorded Mother Nature's Son, sitting alone in the studio, creating something soft and earthy, almost like a lullaby for the land. John brought Julia, written for his mother, filled with delicate finger-picking and words that drifted like wind through tall grass. His happiness as a warm gun was layered and strange, shifting shapes and moods like a dream half remembered. George offered While My Guitar Gently Weeps, a slow-burning ache that seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside him. It featured a guest appearance by Eric Clapton on lead guitar, a quiet gift, a gesture of friendship, adding something rich and warm. Even Ringo contributed a song of his own, Don't Pass Me By, a simple, heartfelt piece that added lightness to the mix. It wasn't polished, but it felt real. These songs weren't connected by a single story. They weren't built to fit together neatly. They were pieces of each member's inner world, placed side by side like pages in different diaries. And yet, the album became something whole, not through unity, but through honesty. Outside the studio, the world was moving quickly. 1968 was a year of unrest and change. In many places, people marched in protest. Leaders fell. Wars dragged on. New voices rose in song and speech. The Beatles, once seen as cheerful symbols of youth, now stood as something more complex. Artists growing in public, exploring sound while the world around them turned. Their fans were growing too. Many who had first heard them as teenagers were now adults. Their lives had changed, and the Beatles had changed with them. The music still mattered, but it mattered differently now. It wasn't just a soundtrack to joy. It became a place of reflection, a space for thought, a quiet companion in uncertain times. Amid all this, Apple Corps was born, a company created by the band to manage their own projects. The idea was to create a space where creativity could thrive. Music, art, film, ideas, anything was welcome. It was bold and generous in spirit, but the details were messy. The business side of things quickly became tangled. The pressures of running a company added more stress to a group already feeling the strain. The Beatles weren't just a band anymore. They were a brand, an organization, and the weight of it all was beginning to show. Still, they returned to the studio. In early 1969, the group began a new project. The plan was simple: go back to basics. Fewer layers, fewer effects, just the four of them playing together again. The sessions were filmed and recorded. The idea was to capture the making of an album, ending with a live performance, a return to something real. But things didn't go smoothly. The studio felt cold. The cameras added pressure. The old ease was harder to find. They disagreed about arrangements, about tone, about how to move forward. Tensions rose. The film, meant to show togetherness, instead revealed distance. Still, music emerged. Let It Be, written by Paul, came out of this time. A soft song, full of grace and stillness. It spoke of peace, of surrender, of trusting the way forward even when the path was unclear. John brought Don't Let Me Down, a raw and emotional piece sung with heart wide open. George wrote I Me Mine, a reflection on ego and self, shaped by his growing spiritual path. Not all of the recordings were smooth. Many were shelved, returned to later, or reworked. The project, eventually named Let It Be, wouldn't be released until the following year. But something important happened during those sessions, a quiet, shining moment. On the rooftop of Apple's building in London, on a cold January day, the Beatles performed together in public for the last time. There was no stage, no lights, just a rooftop, some microphones, and four musicians playing for whoever could hear. People on the street stopped and looked up. Office workers leaned out of windows. Traffic slowed. The band played with joy. Not perfect, but close enough. There were smiles, small glances between them. Old habits returning for just a little while. The cold air wrapped around them, but the sound was warm. They played Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling, and more. The wind lifted their hair. The city moved below. And for a short time, they were just four friends playing music again. When the police finally came and asked them to stop, Paul gave a small grin and thanked the crowd, saying, I hope we passed the audition. It was a quiet, playful farewell. After the rooftop concert, the band continued to record. That spring and summer, they began work on what would become their final studio album, Abbey Road. The sessions were different. There was a sense of purpose, a calmness. Perhaps they knew, even if it was never said, that this might be the last time they worked this way together. The music reflected that balance. Come Together opened the album with a slow, rolling groove. John's lyrics were mysterious, playful, and deep. Paul brought Oh, Darling, and You Never Give Me Your Money, songs full of emotion and layered sounds. George gave the world something, a gentle love song with quiet power. And Here Comes the Sun, a simple, joyful piece that would become one of their most beloved songs. The album ended with a medley, small songs linked together, like memories flowing into one another. It was a journey in sound. Sadness, hope, confusion, laughter, all there, all moving gently forward. And finally, the last line, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. A closing note, a quiet truth. The album cover showed the four of them walking across the street outside Abbey Road Studios. No title, no band name, just them in step, crossing together. The image became iconic, the music timeless. Behind them was a decade of change, of sound, of shared hearts and public dreams. Ahead, there were solo paths, different futures. But in that moment, walking side by side, sound woven between them, they were still the Beatles. Still together, still gentle, still turning, still making something that would never truly fade. Chapter 9, India and Introspection. The world knew the Beatles as performers, writers, and artists. People saw them smiling on album covers, walking across roads, singing on television, or stepping out of airports into waves of fans. But behind the lights and applause, something quieter had begun to grow. It was a feeling that success, on its own, wasn't enough. By the late 1960s, they had achieved more than anyone could have imagined. Hit after hit. Albums that changed how music was made. Tours that shook entire cities. And yet, something was missing, not from their songs, but from within. Fame had brought comfort, but also distance. Crowds replaced quiet moments. Schedules replaced stillness. And as the outside world grew louder, the four men who had started out as boys in Liverpool began to search for something deeper. That search led them far from the cities and stages. It led them to India. The invitation had come through George, whose growing interest in Indian music and philosophy had opened a new door. He had begun learning the sitar and reading spiritual texts. He met Ravi Shankar, the master sitar player, who became both a teacher and a friend. Through Ravi, George learned not just music, but a new way of thinking, one that reached beyond fame and towards something timeless. In early 1968, all four Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, traveled to Rishikesh, a quiet town along the Ganges River, to study transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. It wasn't a publicity trip. There were no concerts, no interviews, no cameras flashing. Just silence, trees, and the flow of the river. They stayed in a peaceful ashram built on the edge of the forest. The air was clear. The routine was simple: meditation in the morning, vegetarian meals, long walks under the sun. The world they had known of traffic, reporters, and studio walls felt far away. For a time, they slowed down. They sat cross-legged in quiet halls, listened to the Maharishi's gentle teachings, and learned to look inward. It wasn't about religion. It was about awareness, stillness, and peace of mind. At night, they picked up their guitars. There was no pressure, no deadline. Songs came gently, shaped by the sounds of the birds, the wind in the leaves, the steady rhythm of thought. They wrote in notebooks and played for each other under the stars. Some of the music would later appear on the White Album, but in that moment, it wasn't about records or releases. It was just music, returning to its simplest form. John wrote Dear Prudence while encouraging a friend to come outside after a long period of quiet. The song was soft, inviting, a gentle call back to the world. Paul wrote Mother Nature's Son, inspired by a talk from the Maharishi. George wrote Long, 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 a quiet reflection that barely whispered. Even Ringo, though he struggled with the food and returned to England early, spoke warmly about the peace he found there. For a few weeks, they were far from the chaos of their usual lives, and in that space, they rediscovered parts of themselves. But peace is not always permanent. As time passed, doubts began to surface. Rumors stirred about the Maharishi. John, in particular, began to feel unsure. Whether the stories were true or simply misunderstandings didn't matter in the end. The trust had been shaken. Quietly, one by one, they left the ashram and returned home. Still, something had changed. The Beatles didn't come back from India with answers, but they came back with questions, and those questions shaped everything that followed. Their songwriting grew more personal, more inward-looking. They had always been curious. Now they were reflective. John began to explore his thoughts and emotions more directly. His music took on a raw, sometimes aching honesty. Songs like Julia, written for his mother, and I'm So Tired, filled with longing, showed a new kind of openness. Paul continued to explore melody, structure, and story. He balanced soft ballads with bold experiments. His songs became more complex, yet still carried the warmth and clarity that had always defined his work. George deepened his spiritual journey. His lyrics spoke of devotion, self-awareness, and wonder. The Inner Light, a song based on a passage from Eastern scripture, was recorded soon after their time in India. Its message was simple: without going out of your door, you can know the ways of heaven. And Ringo, steady and sincere, continued to bring heart and rhythm. His playing anchored the group. His presence, light and human, reminded everyone where they had started. Back in London, the world had kept moving. New bands were rising. Music was changing. The Beatles were no longer just leaders. They were part of a larger wave. And within the band, the differences between them began to show more clearly. They had always been four parts of one whole. Now, there were four individuals, each with a growing sense of self. John became more involved with Yoko Ono. Their bond grew quickly. Together, they began exploring art and expression beyond music, creating short films, sound pieces, and staged events. For some, this closeness was hard to understand. But for John, it was part of his continued search for truth and meaning. Paul remained deeply focused on the music itself. He took the lead on many recording sessions. He shaped ideas, brought in arrangements, and often worked late to refine details. His drive was unmatched. But sometimes it felt like pressure. George, though still quiet in interviews, was finding his voice as a writer. He wanted more space on the albums, more freedom to explore. His songs were no longer just extras. They stood tall beside those of John and Paul. Ringo, caught in the middle, tried to keep peace. But even he could sense the shift. The laughter came less often. The sessions were less playful. They were still a band, but it was harder now. Still, they kept creating. Their music remained full of life. The ideas kept flowing. They released Yellow Submarine, a soundtrack album filled with playful charm and color. They worked on Let It Be, even as tensions rose. And they shaped Abbey Road, perhaps knowing in their hearts that it would be their final masterpiece. India had not given them all the peace they sought, but it had opened a door. It showed them how to pause, how to listen, how to look inward. And in those moments, even brief ones, they found something lasting, a quiet kind of truth, a reminder that beyond the fame, beyond the noise, beyond the world's expectations, there was still the music, and the music would carry on. Chapter 10. The Cracks Appear. By the end of the 1960s, the world had begun to change again. The glow of the early decade had faded. Cities felt more crowded. Voices in the streets were louder. The music, too, was changing. It grew sharper, heavier, more restless. The Beatles, who had once seemed like the soundtrack to all things hopeful and new, now found themselves moving in different directions. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of growth, out of change, and out of time. They had built something rare, a partnership full of joy, creativity, and deep connection. But partnerships, like all living things, bend under pressure. Sometimes they hold. Sometimes, slowly, they begin to shift apart. The sessions for Let It Be had been difficult. What had started as an idea to return to simple performances had grown into something more complex. Cameras were brought in to film the process, but instead of capturing unity, they caught moments of tension, long silences, disagreements over how a song should sound, quiet frustration behind careful words. Paul wanted focus. He brought energy to the sessions, pushed for progress, tried to keep the group moving. He believed in the music and in the band, but his direction sometimes felt too strong to the others. John had drifted toward new interests. He was spending more time with Yoko Ono, exploring art, sound, and ways of thinking that didn't always fit into the old patterns. He was still writing, still singing, but his attention wasn't always with the group. George had found his voice as a songwriter. After years of waiting in the wings, he was writing songs that carried weight and beauty. But getting those songs onto the albums was still a challenge. He felt unheard at times, unseen, and that feeling stayed with him. Even Ringo, usually the peacemaker, felt the strain. He loved the others that had never changed, but the room no longer felt light. The laughter that once echoed through long nights had faded to quiet nods and tired looks. They didn't fight all the time. They still had moments of closeness, still shared smiles and memories. But the threads had loosened. There was no dramatic ending, no single moment when it all fell apart. Just small things, missed meetings, delayed projects, one less phone call, then two, and then silence. During this time, a new figure entered their world, Alan Klein, a manager with strong opinions and a bold voice. John supported Klein and believed he could help bring order to the business side of things. George and Ringo agreed, but Paul was cautious. He preferred the idea of his in-laws helping manage the group's affairs. He trusted family. He trusted calm. This disagreement over management deepened the divide. It wasn't about music. It was about trust, about control, about who would guide what they had built. Meanwhile, their shared company, Apple Corps, struggled. It had been created with good intentions, meant to support artists and ideas. But it was hard to manage. Money flowed out too quickly. Projects drifted. Frustrations grew. Despite all of this, they kept making music. They returned to the studio for what would be their final album together, Abbey Road. And in those sessions, something gentle returned. Maybe it was the knowledge that time was short. Maybe it was respect. Or maybe it was simply the music itself pulling them back into rhythm. They worked more carefully now, more kindly. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had softened. They recorded with care. They listened more. And what came from those sessions was some of their most beautiful work. The album opened with Come Together, a cool, rolling track with lyrics that felt like riddles. It set the tone, calm on the surface, full of feeling underneath. George's Something followed soon after. It was clear, tender, and deeply honest. A love song that spoke softly without showing off. Frank Sinatra would later call it one of the greatest songs ever written. Paul brought Golden Slumbers and You Never Give Me Your Money, songs about change, memory, and letting go. His melodies were smooth, his voice strong, but filled with emotion. Ringo added Octopus's Garden, a sweet, light-hearted track that reminded listeners of the band's playful side. It was a child's dream, floating gently in the middle of heavier thoughts. And then came the medley, a series of short songs woven into one long piece, like waves rolling into each other. Sun King, Mean Mr. Mustard, Polythene Pam, and others. Each one different. Each one different. Each one flowing into the next. The last moments of the album brought it all together. The end featured a brief drum solo from Ringo, the only one he would ever record with the band. Then, one by one, the others traded guitar solos. Not to compete, not to show off, just to share. To speak in notes where words had failed. And finally, the last line. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. Simple, soft, true. After Abbey Road, there was little left to say. They still had one album to release, Let It Be, which had been recorded earlier but held back while they figured out what to do with it. Phil Spector, a producer known for his heavy sound, was brought in to finish it. He added strings, layered the tracks, and shaped it into something grander than originally planned. When the album came out, it carried mixed feelings. It included songs full of warmth, Two of Us, Let It Be, In the Long and Winding Road. But for many, it felt like a goodbye. The rooftop performance that had closed the film version of Let It Be stood as their final moment together in public. After that, the silence grew. In April 1970, Paul quietly announced that he was leaving the band. There was no big speech, no headline show, just a statement. It was gentle, almost sad, but clear. The Beatles were no longer a band. Fans around the world felt the news like a cold wind. They had grown up with the Beatles, danced to them, cried to them, fallen in love with them. Their music had been more than songs. It had been a presence, a light in the corner of the room. But nothing lasts forever. The end didn't erase what had come before. It didn't touch the laughter and I want to hold your hand, the rush of a hard day's night, the calm of yesterday, or the depth of something. The songs remained. So did the friendship, though now from a distance. Each of them moved forward in their own way. John explored art and activism. He wrote songs with Yoko, songs about peace, about pain, about hope. Paul formed a new band, Wings, and continued to write, to play, to explore music in fresh ways. George, now fully confident, released All Things Must Pass, a rich and spiritual album that showed how much he had held inside. Ringo recorded solo albums and acted in films, always bringing his gentle warmth wherever he went. And in the space between them, something soft remained. Not the Beatles as a group, but the bond, the story, the music, the quiet that comes after a long song ends. Chapter 11, The Rooftop Farewell. On a gray morning in January 1969, the city of London moved with its usual rhythm. Buses rolled past storefronts. Footsteps echoed between the buildings. Office lights flickered on as workers settled in for another day. No one expected anything unusual. It was just another winter morning. But above Savile Row, on the roof of an ordinary office building, something remarkable was about to happen. The building belonged to Apple Corps, the company the Beatles had formed to manage their projects. Inside, tensions were still fresh. The band had been recording what they hoped would be a return to basics. Simpler songs, less production, just music played together. They called it the Get Back Sessions. The process hadn't been easy. Disagreements and frustration had clouded the studio. Voices were quieter now. Smiles came more slowly. But they still wanted to finish something, to close the circle. So they made a quiet decision. No press release, no public announcement. Just the four of them, their instruments, a few close friends, and a rooftop. The crew set up the equipment. Cables stretched across the gravel. Speakers were arranged near the ledges. Microphones were tested. Below, the city carried on, unaware. Then a guitar strummed. It was cold up there. The wind tugged at their jackets. Ringo wore a red raincoat. George stood in a fur coat, his hair brushing his collar. Paul bounced slightly to stay warm. John smiled behind round glasses. They began with Get Back. From the very first note, something familiar returned. The rhythm, the energy, the way they watched each other, listening as they played. It was not a perfect performance. It didn't need to be. What mattered was that it was real. Down on the street, people began to notice. Some looked up, trying to find the source of the sound. Office workers leaned out of windows. Pedestrians paused, tilting their heads. The music echoed between the buildings, floating down like sunlight through clouds. The Beatles played Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling, and other songs they had been working on. Each one rang out into the morning air. The chords were warm, the voices clear. For a while, it felt like time slowed. There was no screaming crowd, no flashing cameras, no spotlight. Just four musicians doing what they had always done, playing together, listening, adjusting, laughing between songs. They looked relaxed, comfortable, even joyful. In the middle of the set, John made a quiet joke to Paul between takes. George adjusted the settings on his amp. Ringo kept the rhythm steady, his breath rising in little clouds with the cold. It was music without pressure. And perhaps, for a moment, it felt like the early days again, before the stadiums, before the headlines. Just four friends on a rooftop, playing as if no one were watching, even as the world slowly turned its head to listen. Eventually, the police arrived. There had been noise complaints. Some nearby offices were disrupted. The officers moved up the stairs, unsure of what they'd find. When they reached the roof, they didn't stop the performance right away. They watched for a moment. The scene was unusual, but not dangerous. Just surprising. A band, playing in the open sky. The final song was another take of Get Back. Paul's voice rose strong and bright. John added harmonies. George's guitar flowed between the lines. Ringo's beat held steady beneath it all. Then the music stopped. The silence after was gentle. John turned to the microphone and said, "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we pass the audition." There was laughter, smiles, small waves, and then they stepped away. It would be the last time the Beatles ever performed live together. No one called it a farewell, but deep down, perhaps they all felt it. Not as an ending filled with sadness, but as a soft close, like a curtain falling at the end of a quiet play. The footage of that rooftop show would become part of the Let It Be film. People would watch it again and again over the years, not just for the music, but for the feeling, for the sight of four people still connected, even as they prepared to move apart. Back inside the building, coats were removed, instruments packed. Warm tea was made to chase off the chill. Conversations were brief, but kind. Outside, the city returned to its usual rhythm. But something had shifted. For those who had heard the music rise above the rooftops, the day would stay with them. And for the Beatles, something had settled. They had shared their last song together in the open air, with no plan, no stage, no fanfare. Just a few songs, a few smiles, and the sky above. In the months that followed, they returned to their work. Let It Be would be completed later, shaped by others and released after the band had quietly ended. The world would feel that ending. In newspapers, on radios, in quiet conversations across kitchen tables. But the rooftop farewell had already spoken the truth. The Beatles, who had started in clubs and played before thousands, ended with something smaller, something quieter, something more human. And maybe that was how it was meant to be. Not with noise, but with music. Not with a headline, but with a single chord ringing out into the morning air. They had given so much to the world, to each other, to the sound that lived in so many hearts. And now, with one last shared rhythm, they let it go. Chapter 12, A World Without Four. The Beatles had always been more than just a band. They had become a symbol of something larger, of youth, of change, of unity and sound. For many people, their music was not just a soundtrack, but a companion, something that stayed close through laughter, heartbreak, discovery, and stillness. So when the news spread that they were no longer together, it felt like a shift in the air. Something soft had ended, not with a bang, but with silence. There were no farewell shows, no press conferences, no public goodbyes, Just the slow truth, whispered written in newspapers, passed between friends, that the Beatles were no more, and the world in its quiet way learned to live without them. But endings are not always losses. Sometimes they are beginnings in disguise. Each of the four had been part of a shared story shaped by years of friendship, sound, and shared rooms. Now, they faced something new themselves. No band to lean on, no group to return to, just space and the chance to find their own voice. John Lennon stepped into this space with something deep and raw. He had always been searching for truth, for peace, for a sense of who he was behind the image. With Yoko Ono at his side, he began to create music that stripped away the polish. His first solo works were simple, sometimes rough, but filled with emotion. Songs like Mother, Working Class Hero, and God spoke not of fame, but of fear, longing, and growth. He was not interested in being a pop star anymore. He wanted to be honest. He sang about his childhood, his doubts, his dreams. He released the Plastic Ono Band album not loud, not grand, but brave in its vulnerability. Later, his song, Imagine, would float into the world like a soft breeze. Its piano was gentle. Its message was clear. Paul McCartney found his own path too, though it began in quiet. He retreated with his family to a farm in Scotland, far from the noise of the city. There, he wrote songs slowly, played with new ideas, and took care of the land. The change of pace suited him. He recorded a solo album, simply titled McCartney, where he played nearly every instrument himself. At first, some didn't understand it. It felt small, homemade. But in that simplicity, Paul found freedom. He was no longer writing to fit a group. He was writing from his own heart. Soon, he formed a new band, Wings, and began touring again. The music was different, lighter in some places, bolder in others. Songs like Band on the Run, Jet, and Maybe I'm Amazed reminded people that Paul still carried the melody deep inside him. George Harrison had always been the quiet one, the thoughtful one, the one whose songs had waited their turn. Now he had space to speak. His first major solo album, All Things Must Pass, was not just a step forward, it was a full breath. The songs came in waves, rich and full, shaped by years of waiting. My Sweet Lord echoed with devotion. Isn't It a Pity whispered about loss and healing. The album filled 3 records and covered all corners of feeling. George didn't seek the spotlight, but his music found it anyway. Not because it was loud, but because it was honest. Ringo's star, ever steady, also stepped forward. His solo work was often joyful and full of charm. Songs like It Don't Come Easy and Photograph climbed the charts with ease. He worked with other musicians, acted in films, and carried a lightness that reminded people of the warmth at the heart of the band. Ringo didn't try to be what he wasn't. He didn't chase after big statements. Instead, he shared what he had always shared: kindness, rhythm, and a laugh that softened the room. The 4 men moved forward, each in their own way. They didn't always speak. They didn't always agree. But the bond remained, quiet, unspoken, and real. Sometimes there were letters. Sometimes small messages passed through others. The connection didn't break. It just changed. Fans followed their solo paths. Some leaned toward Paul's bright melodies. Others found peace in George's depth. Some connected with John's edge. Others smiled with Ringo's charm. It didn't matter. There was something for everyone. And still, the Beatles' music lived on. Old albums played on new turntables. Children discovered the songs their parents had danced to. New bands covered the classics. And those timeless harmonies, warm, clear, close, still found their way into the hearts of new listeners. In interviews, the question always came, will they ever get back together? Sometimes the answer was soft. Sometimes it was firm. But most often, it was honest. No one really knew, because what they had shared was rare. And rare things, once released, often remain free. As the 1970s moved on, each Beatle faced joys and struggles. John continued writing, raising a family, and speaking out for peace. He stepped away from music for a while, choosing to stay home and care for his son, Sean. When he returned with the album Double Fantasy, it was filled with gentleness, songs about love, home, and finding balance. Paul continued making music with wings, exploring new sounds, new places, and always returning to melody. His voice remained steady, his craft unshaken. He toured, recorded, and kept moving. George focused on spirituality, charity, and personal growth. He helped organize the concert for Bangladesh, one of the first major charity concerts in music history. He planted gardens, practiced meditation, and made space for quiet. Ringo stayed close to people. He played with friends. He joined supergroups. He smiled in interviews and brought rhythm wherever he went. None of them tried to replace the Beatles. They didn't need to. What they had built together still stood, not as something lost, but as something finished, complete. It became a part of music history. But more than that, it became a part of people, a part of growing up, a part of rainy afternoons, long walks, and quiet nights. In a world without four, the music remained. In bedrooms, cafes, classrooms, and long drives. In headphones and record shops. In memories and in first discoveries. The Beatles no longer stood on the same stage, but the sound they had made together still played, softly, gently, always. Chapter 13, Remembering John. In the years that followed the end of the Beatles, John Lennon stepped into a new rhythm. He left behind the world of touring and stadiums, choosing instead a smaller, more personal kind of life. The fame still followed him. It always would. But John was no longer chasing the spotlight. He was chasing truth. With Yoko Ono at his side, he began building a life that looked different from what most expected. Together, they created music, art, and moments that blended performance with message. Their bed in for peace, where they sat in pajamas and spoke softly to the press, was simple in form but bold in meaning. They didn't shout. They just stayed still, and the stillness said enough. John's early solo work carried echoes of his past, but also the weight of experience. The album Plastic Ono Band was raw. It stripped away all the layers. No rich arrangements, no studio tricks. Just his voice, his guitar or piano, and the words he needed to say. He sang about his mother, about his fear, about the confusion that had followed him through youth and fame. Mother, isolation, working class hero. Each song felt like a quiet confession, spoken late at night when the world had stopped spinning. There was no effort to impress, no need to charm. John had spent his early years behind a wall of wit. Now he was opening the door. He was still restless, still questioning everything. He challenged old ideas. He spoke out against war, against injustice. But there was softness too. Songs like Love and Look at Me felt as if they were written not for the world, but for one listener alone. In 1971, he released Imagine. It was not loud, not even complex, just a simple piano melody and a few lines that reached across borders, across beliefs, and across time. Imagine all the people living life in peace. The words weren't shouted. They didn't demand. They invited. The song became something larger than music, a quiet anthem, a wish spoken gently. John never claimed to have the answers, but he believed in asking better questions. His life in New York became a kind of rhythm. Long walks through Central Park, mornings in the kitchen, late night writing. He had a way of disappearing into the crowd, slipping on a hat and walking unnoticed. It was a freedom he had not felt in years. He and Yoko moved into the Dakota Building, an old, quiet apartment complex near the park. Their home became a mix of music, art, and family. In 1975, their son Sean was born, and for a while, Sean stepped back completely. He called it his house husband phase. No albums, no interviews, just quiet days making bread, reading, drawing, spending time with his son. It was not retirement, it was renewal. And then 5 years later, he returned to music. Double Fantasy was released in 1980. It was a collaboration with Yoko, a back-and-forth album of her songs and his. John's voice sounded calm, focused, and full of warmth. Songs like Watching the Wheels, Woman, and Beautiful Boy carried no bitterness, only peace. He sang about love, about home, about finding balance after years of searching. It felt like a beginning, but the beginning did not last. On the night of December 8, 1980, as he returned to his apartment, John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota by a man waiting in the shadows. He died within the hour. The news traveled fast. Across cities and towns, people stood still. Radios fell silent. Television anchors spoke with shaking voices. Some cried, others stared. The world, for a brief moment, felt colder. In New York, thousands gathered outside the Dakota in quiet mourning. No shouting, no speeches, just candles, flowers, and songs sung softly in the cold. In Liverpool, people lit candles and stood together in silence. All over the world, hearts broke not only for a lost musician, but for what he had represented: the voice, the humor, the questions, the hope. John had not been perfect. He had spoken honestly about his flaws, his past, his struggles. But that was part of what made him real. He had lived fully. He had changed. And he had tried again and again to bring truth into the world through sound and thought. His words remained. His music did not fade. And in the stillness that followed his passing, something quiet was born. A deeper understanding of what he had given. Not just to the Beatles, not just to music, but to the human heart. Years passed. Statues were raised. Streets renamed. In Central Park, a small area near his home was set aside as a place of peace, Strawberry Fields. There, a circular mosaic simply reads, "Imagine." Visitors still walk there, placing flowers, poems, and notes. Some sit quietly. Others hum his songs. It has become not a memorial of sorrow, but of reflection. A place where his voice can still be heard, not in sound, but in memory. His friends remembered him in their own ways. Paul wrote songs in tribute, speaking of their time together with warmth and a tinge of sadness. George quietly dedicated performances. Ringo offered soft words and kept his spirit close in stories. They had laughed with him, argued with him, shared stages and studios with him. And now, each held a piece of him. But perhaps the most lasting tribute was not found in concerts or ceremonies. It was found in the way people carried his songs, in how they sang Imagine at weddings, at vigils, in moments of joy and pain, in how they listened to In My Life and remembered someone they loved. John Lennon's voice had once filled crowded halls. Now, it filled something smaller, quieter. The space inside a person. The space where music lives, not just as sound, but as feeling. The Beatles had begun with his voice and guitar. He had helped shape their path with a mix of rebellion and tenderness. He had pulled words from thin air and made them matter. And in the end, even after the lights went out, the voice remained. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. Chapter 14. Still Making Music. After John was gone, the world didn't feel the same. There was a quietness in the air, like a familiar light had faded. But the days continued, the seasons turned, and slowly Gently, the others kept going. They didn't rush into tributes. They didn't fill the silence with big speeches. Instead, they honored him in the way they knew best, by making music. Paul McCartney returned to the studio with a soft kind of energy. His album Tug of War, released in 1982, carried a sense of reflection. One of its most moving songs, Here Today, was written as a letter to John, a quiet conversation that would never be answered. In the song, Paul imagined what he might say if John were still there. He spoke not as a legend, not as a Beatle, but as a friend. The lyrics were tender and uncertain, like someone working through a feeling that words couldn't quite hold. It was a song about regret, about memory, and about love. Paul kept writing. His melodies continued to flow. Through the 1980s and into the 90s, he tried new sounds, worked with new musicians, and kept performing. His voice aged gently, but his gift for melody never left him. He toured again, bringing old Beatles songs back to the stage. Songs that had once been played to screaming crowds were now sung in quiet harmony, with thousands of voices joining in. From Let It Be to Hey Jude, the music was no longer just entertainment. It had become a kind of shared remembering. George Harrison moved at a different pace. He had always valued privacy, peace, and personal growth. In the years after John's death, George continued to write, but he also spent time with his family and his garden. He lived in a home filled with trees and quiet spaces, far from the rush of the city. In 1987, he released Cloud 9, an album that felt both relaxed and strong. The single, Got My Mind Set on You, climbed the charts, bringing George's voice back to radios and living rooms. He smiled in interviews, played on television again, and reminded everyone that he was still listening, still thinking, still singing. But perhaps his most joyful return came in the form of a band, a supergroup called the Traveling Wilburys. With Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, and Roy Orbison, George joined a project that was playful, easy, and full of mutual respect. They gave themselves new names, played without pressure, and created songs that felt like old friends around a table. The music was warm, the words were kind, and the joy in George's voice was clear. Ringo Starr, too, continued his journey. His solo albums kept coming, each one a reflection of his easy charm. He never tried to be someone else. He stayed true to his sound, steady, clear, and full of heart. He worked with friends. He made time for fans. He started his own band, the All-Star Band, where he invited other musicians to join him on stage. They toured together, playing songs from each of their pasts, smiling as they shared the spotlight. Ringo's concerts became something special, not grand spectacles, but moments of connection. He would wave to the crowd, tell stories, sing the songs people remembered, and always end with his simple wish: peace and love. Through all of this, the three remaining Beatles kept in touch, sometimes quietly, sometimes only through letters or phone calls. But the bond remained, not just in the music, but in the memory of where they had begun. Four boys from Liverpool, once unknown, now forever remembered. In the 1990s, something unexpected happened. The idea of reuniting, in a way, took shape again, not in the form of a new album or tour, but as a project called the Beatles Anthology. It began with interviews, old photos, and hours of recordings. The goal was to tell the story from the inside. Paul, George, and Ringo sat down together. They laughed about old times. They spoke with honesty about the hard parts, and they listened not only to the old tracks, but to the echoes of who they had been. The project included a book, a documentary series, and most surprisingly, 2 new songs. Using recordings of John's voice from old demos, the 3 remaining members carefully built arrangements around his vocals. It was delicate work, respectful, emotional. The first of these songs, Free as a Bird, was released in 1995. It wasn't a hit in the traditional sense, but it didn't need to be. It was a gift to the fans, to each other, and to the memory of what they had shared. Hearing John's voice again, blended with Paul's, George's, and Ringo's, felt like a reunion of the spirit. Not a return to the past, but a soft echo of it. The second song, Real Love, followed in 1996. Again, it was gentle, not grand, but full of feeling. The project reminded the world that while time had passed, the music had never truly ended. As the new century began, the world changed quickly. New music rose. New names filled the charts. But the Beatles remained, not as competition, not as nostalgia, but as something steady, a sound that had become part of the fabric of life. Paul continued to tour. He played for small crowds and stadiums alike. He sang Beatles songs with new arrangements, sometimes with just a piano and voice, letting the words stand alone. George, always private, faced illness with quiet strength. In 2001, he passed away, surrounded by loved ones. The news brought sadness, but also gratitude. People remembered his kindness, his smile, his depth. Ringo kept playing, kept smiling, kept sharing his steady beat with the world. He became a symbol of simple joy, a man who had lived through so much and still waved to the crowd with peace signs in both hands. And through all of it, the songs remained. Children discovered them. Grandparents passed them down. Musicians covered them. Choirs sang them. People played them at weddings, funerals, road trips, and quiet nights alone. The Beatles were no longer just a band. They had become a part of life, not because they were perfect, but because they had been real. They had started as friends, made something beautiful, lost things, found new things, and carried on. Their music had shaped generations. But more than that, it had offered comfort. It still did. In every strum of Let It Be, in every harmony of Because, in every word of All You Need Is Love. The story had many chapters, some bright, some shadowed, but the music always found a way forward. And those who remained, Paul and Ringo, carried that forward with grace. Not by trying to recapture what had been, but by honoring it, and by making room for what still might be. Chapter 15, The Long and Winding Road. Time moves softly when you're not watching. Seasons pass, faces change, but some things remain. A melody, a memory, a name whispered in the quiet of a late evening. The Beatles were no longer four voices singing side by side, no longer a band gathered in a studio or stepping onto a stage. But their story had not ended. It had only settled into a new form, one that lives in hearts rather than headlines, in the steady turning of a record, or in the hum of a familiar chorus drifting through an open window. Years passed. The music industry shifted. Technology changed how people listened to songs. Vinyl turned into tapes. Tapes became CDs, then files, then streams. But no matter the format, the sound of the Beatles remained, because their music had never been about the moment. It had always been about the feeling. It was there in the laughter of Obladi Oblada, in the echoing beauty of Across the Universe, in the aching simplicity of Yesterday, and in the final promise of the end. Their songs did not grow old. They simply became part of the world around them. Paul McCartney continued to write and perform into his later years. His concerts became something between celebration and remembrance. He played songs written decades ago, not out of duty, but because they still meant something. They still held light. Audiences sang with him, sometimes in soft voices, sometimes as one great wave of sound. Children sat on shoulders. Couples held hands. Strangers swayed beside each other, all tied together by the rhythm of a life once lived through songs. Paul spoke of John with love, of George with gentleness, of Ringo with laughter. He never tried to replace the past, but he honored it with every note. He also kept creating, writing classical pieces, experimenting with new sounds, collaborating with younger artists. His voice, though older, still carried the melody like an old friend walking beside you. Ringo Starr, too, remained a presence in music. His all-star band became a gathering place for joyful memories and easy fun. He toured, smiled, waved, and played his drums with the same steady beat that had always grounded the band. Each show ended the same way. He would step up to the microphone and say, as he always had, peace and love. Simple words, but true ones. Together, Paul and Ringo stood as living links to something larger than themselves. They didn't wear it like a title. They carried it like a memory, gentle, proud, and kind. And all around them, the music lived on, in the voices of artists who covered Beatles songs with reverence, in the soundtracks of films, in the stories told by parents to their children about how these four friends from Liverpool changed the world without meaning to. There were museums and documentaries, re-releases, and remastered albums. Books filled shelves. Streets bore their names. But none of it mattered as much as the quiet moment when a song played and someone, somewhere, stopped what they were doing just to listen. That was the legacy. Not the fame, not the charts, but the connection. The long and winding road that had led from basement clubs to crowded stadiums, from studio corners to rooftop skies, now stretched into something timeless. Not a straight path, but one filled with turns, with shadows and light, with sorrow and joy, like life itself. And for those who followed that road, for those who listened closely, there was always something to find. A sense of comfort, a touch of wonder, a reminder that even in a world full of noise, four voices once found a way to blend in perfect harmony. In the last years of his life, George Harrison had said that everything else, the success, the fame, was just a byproduct. The real reward, he believed, was in the music itself, in the joy of making something honest and whole. And perhaps that's the truest way to remember them. Not as icons, not even as legends, but as people who gave their best again and again through melody and sound. John, Paul, George, Ringo, each different, each essential. Together they made something that has never faded. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real, and because it was made with love. As new generations continue to discover their songs, the road continues, gently, quietly, like a familiar tune heard from another room. The notes drift in, the words come softly, and the feeling returns. You don't need to know the history. You don't need to remember the dates. You only need to listen. And there, in the space between the notes, you'll find them, still walking together, still singing, still reminding us that even the longest road can lead us home.